This series is a chance to explore the values that we hold together as a church. They define who we are, what we do, and what we pursue. I didn't realize that rhymed to just now. And in essence, our values are the glue that binds us together. It's what makes you and I want to be here together. But they're also the values that bind us to our mission, what it is that we do together. And so for 3 weeks, we are going to shed light on the significance of the 3 values that we have as a church. We're going to talk about them, why we have them. We're going to talk about how they get illustrated and illuminated in the scriptures and what it means for us to live them out individually and communally. Now, we all have values. We all have individuals or convictions or ideals that we value in life. It defines who we are, what we do, what we might pursue. If you know me, I love reading. I enjoy reading. And so if you would walk into my office, there are over 1,000 books that are on my shelf in my office alone. That doesn't count the ones that are at home in closets and things like that. And I have that many books because my value is reading. And because I value organization, I use an app called Library Thing, where the minute I get a new book, I scan the barcode, I put it in a certain section on my shelf, and I keep everything databased in that way. You know I value books not only because I read and collect them, but because it shifts how I spend my money. I like buying books to add to my collection. The value of reading means that I value being around other people who enjoy reading. It means that I look to disciple, and I value discipling and passing that trait on to my children. It means that I find time in my schedule to focus on reading. It means that I'm always making space and time to acquire more books to read. Anybody else have a book problem? This is how values shape who we are. This is the same with the church. What we value, we invest in by making sure it is what we are together and what we pursue together. Now, sometimes values change. What we may value today may be not what we value tomorrow. For instance, in my teens, when I was in a great spiritual search, I valued simplicity, and I valued it to such a degree that I wanted to be able to live, and you've heard me say this before, out of a suitcase. So anything that didn't fit in that suitcase was of no value to me. Now, I think we all know that I really like baseball, right? You would say, yeah, Jeff really values baseball. But in the years that I spent touring and vagabonding across the country and living out of a suitcase, baseball found little value to me because I had something of higher value, that I was on this great spiritual search for meaning and purpose. And in that, the only thing I valued was being able to live in a suitcase. And if it didn't fit there and I didn't have time for it, it just got cut out of my life. Now that I have kids and a wife, of course, I value having a house, cars, kids, usually kids. And our values of a church can also be seasonal like that. There are times that what we value now may not be what we value tomorrow. There are times a church is called to be something in a season that it might be not in another. For instance, church planning. When you start a church and you're at a church, it's only 0 to 50 people. They say they don't need a pastor. They value having a leader who is a lover. They want a pastor who is more like a father or a mother. They do that because they want the church is much more family-sized. Values emerge from who we are, what we believe, and the same is true for us as a church. What we value, and listen to this again, we invest in by making sure it's who we are together, what we do together, and what we pursue together. You might even ask, why do we have values as a church? I mean, we have a confession of faith, right? I mean, isn't that what we value together? Or you might say, I mean, at the end of the day, didn't Jesus just tell the church, love God with all of your heart and love your neighbor as yourself? I mean, isn't that what the value of the church is? Or maybe we'd say, you know, Matthew 6:33 says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things will be added to you. So do we really need values as a church outside of such statements? Well, the answer, I think, is simpler than we might realize. Yes, we have a confession of faith that helps us attempt to understand who God is theologically and how to respond to him. Yes, we are called to seek first the kingdom of God and also to proclaim it. Yes, we are called to love God and love our neighbors, but how we do that here in our context, our localized setting, might be a little different than how a church in another context lives out those same core convictions. Each church has a unique way of being called to live out who they are and what God has called them to. For instance, Peter, follower of Jesus, was called mostly to preach to Jewish audiences. Paul, without a doubt, was on the opposite end of that. He was called to preach to Gentiles. Philip was quick to baptize, and when the other disciples show up on the scene, they say, "Hey, did you baptize him yet in the Spirit?" And I gave him John's baptism. What are you guys talking about? Right? Each one of us individually has callings on our lives and values in our lives that are different than those around us. We're all committed to the same great God and the same great calling on our life. But how we live and love like Jesus in our context might be different than how I do it or someone next to you does it. Each individual church is also equipped and empowered to carry out the grand scheme of God in localized and unique ways. Those specific ways become our values. A church consultant by the name of Toady Hunt says this: a church that effectively develops, articulates, and appropriates its core values can remain clear on what it believes about itself and focused on what God calls it to be and do. I love this idea that if we can articulate our values, not just me as the leader, not just Josh as the worship leader, if a church, if we all can articulate who we are and what we're supposed to do, God will be at work in who we are. So values help set identity. They help us see who we are and what we believe. They help us follow orders. Like we know that at the key of who we are, and we're going to look at this later, worship is the most important thing. Values set identity. And the other reason we have values is because they set investment. You guys know that I like eyes. And what do you call this when I do this? You know this, Katrina. You've pointed this out to me before. What do you call these things? Alliterations, that's what it's called. I love alliterations. So we have 3 I's today, right? Values set identity, but they also set investment. They help us set what we do, where we invest, or where we look to make an impact. It helps us say yes or no to something. So, for instance, we have core values, and if somebody's like, hey, you guys should think about holding this event, the first question I always ask myself is, how does it help us with our core values? And if it doesn't help our core values, then it helps determine our investment. Not a bad thing, just not our thing. Not every good thing is a God thing, remember that. Then values also set intentionality. This is where we know where we are pursuing together, what God has gifted us with, where He wants us to grow in, what we are aiming for. If we're playing darts or archery, it is that target, that thing that we are looking to accomplish in everything that we are. Now, some church movements have hundreds of values. Some have 7. I think the Brethren in Christ have 7, and that's kind of common. You know, believe it or not, the United States has core values. Can't remember what they are, but we do, right? The liberty, pursue liberty. Somebody help me out. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That has been nicknamed the core values. Thank you, Justin, of our country. I did not write those down. I was like, there's no way I'm going to forget them, and then I forgot them. Right? Shows you how good I am with the government. And so, at the end of the day, everything that we have in life values something. The more values we have, the harder it is to hit the target. And so in every aspect of who we are, our value should be found. Whether it is that we're holding a worship night, or that we're holding an outreach, or that we are gathering on Sunday mornings, or having Sunday school, or releasing a leader, in each one of those areas, our core values should show up. If we have 20 core values, it's going to be a really hard hurdle to reach every time. Our vision as a church is to be a church community that is learning to live and love like Jesus. Our theological understanding is our confession of faith in a Mennonite perspective. But what are our values? What are our values? They hang up around our church. We value, hey, good job, guys. It's all right. We value worship by continually focusing on and surrendering to God and His character, which transforms our individual lives and relationships. Today, on the backside of your bulletin, you find this. I encourage you to fill it out and hold it before you this week. We value worship by continually focusing on and surrendering to God and His character, which transforms our individual lives and relationships. In the next few weeks, we're going to look at our other core values, which are community and mission. Sense of up, in, out. You want the worship one again? Yeah, this one. Oh, I didn't go back far enough. By continually focusing on and surrendering to God and His character, which transforms our individual lives and relationships. We good? I feel like a presenter. So when we talk about our values, and this morning we're going to talk about our value of worship. One of my favorite things is this thing called the Westminster Catechism. How many people had to memorize that as a kid? Anybody ever have to learn that? In the 1600s, theologians had gathered. And they said, what are the core values of what it means to be a Christian? What does it mean to really be a follower of Jesus? And the first thing, the overarching statement these theologians came up with is this idea that the chief end of man, have you guys heard this, is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. In other words, we are called to worship and illuminate God in all that we say and do. So what we as parents and grandparents, workers, neighbors, business people, whatever it is that we do, we are first and foremost worshipers of God. Like Jehoshaphat in that story I read in the beginning, we are always to be bowed to the ground in all that we do. Now I wonder if we polled our neighbors, or maybe even each other, and said, is this what you identify Christians as? Worshipers of God? I wonder if that's what they'd say. In fact, as I scoured our confession of faith, which I uphold and believe and am convicted by, what shocked me was one statement that said, above all else, we are to worship God. It was absent. Everything dealt with out, right? Like we worship God so that we can do this. There was no call to Christians to be pure worshipers of God because of who He is. The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. What's interesting is a little less than just 200 years later, relatively in the history of time, 200 years is nothing. Charles Spurgeon shows up on the scene and he says, I learned when I was a boy that the chief end of man was to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. But I hear now, according to this new theology, that the chief end of God is to glorify man and enjoy Him forever. Yet, this is the turning of things upside down. 200 years after this statement by these theologians that the chief end of all we are as humans is to be worshiping God, already Charles Spurgeon is saying, but what seems to be happening is it's all about us, and God gets wedged into the midst. Now we are 830 some years later. What would Charles Spurgeon say today? There's even a shift in our worship songs. Like, one of the things that I loved growing up was when we got to sing a praise song. So I grew up in a very hymn-based church, and we sang a lot about God. He's great, he sat on the old rugged cross. And then we started singing these songs in the late 80s, early 90s that were directed to God. Shifted everything for me. There's a difference between singing Old Rugged Cross, which is a beautiful song, and I love your presence. What's the difference? One of them sings about God and what we get from God, and it glorifies our relationship with God, making it all more about us. But when we say, I love your presence, it's all about who? It's all about God. It's this upward thing. And when those songs started to come out in my spiritual searches, I encountered them, especially songs like, there was this song came out in 2000 called Hungry that just wrecked me. Like, it is, I thought I had the lyrics printed here, but it is a song directed totally at God. Too often, even in new worship songs, though, we sing about what we get from God. You're a good, good Father is a great song. But if we talk about the lyrics of it, it directs it back towards what we're receiving from God. And those things are needed. But at the end of the day, we are called at the chief end of all mankind to worship God just because He's God. So in this way, when we talk about our core values, our worship core values are upward core value. And it is the initial one. It is the primary one. It's the thing that we pursue. We should never have a board meeting, a Sunday school meeting, without some form of worship in it, because it is what defines us. Worship then affects how we do community. Worship then affects how we do mission. As I said earlier, our core value of worship reads, we value worship by continually focusing on and surrendering to God and His character, which transforms our individual lives. That word continually, I want you to reflect on. It's so easy to just skip right past that word and just say, oh, it's just a descriptor word, but it's not. It's not. We value worship by continually. We value worship by continually. In Romans 12, when Paul is writing to the church in Rome, he tells in verse 1 to be continually offering their bodies as a living sacrifice, because this is your true and proper worship. He says that life is to be lived as a sacrifice in such a way that it is used as a holy and pleasing sense of worship to God. And he goes on to say that we need to keep renewing our mind to be able to stay sharp and focused on what it is that is holy and pleasing to God. It's this sense that we are continually to be focused on worship. And secondly, we see that this sense focusing on. We are not to worship God continually, but always focusing on Him and His heart in every situation. In the moment of despair, Prophet Jeremiah in 29:13, God says this, you will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all of your heart. When you focus on me. When you don't focus on anything else. When you seek me with all of your heart. That's when I'll show up. That's when I will be near to you. Similarly, in Matthew 15:18, as Jesus is looking at some people in His day, mainly religious people, the charge He gives them is this. These people honor me with their lips, right? They're worshiping me with their intellect, their mouth, but it hasn't permeated their hearts. Their hearts are far from me. They are not truly focusing everything they are on who God is. Jesus acknowledges that we can live lives that we think are full of worship, but if our hearts aren't into what we're doing, then we aren't actually in a place of focusing on God, and it doesn't matter what we say or do. David, one of the most famous psalters of all time and worshipers, he gets this in Psalms 46:10. He writes, be still and know that He is God. And then just a little later in 57:7, he writes, "My heart is confident in you, O God. My heart is confident. No matter what, I can sing your praises." He can sing, he can worship because he is focused on, in his heart, who God is. Then we talk about this aspect of surrender. Again, Romans 12 comes to mind. We are to live our lives as sacrifices. Or Romans 16, 24 to 25, Jesus looks at his disciples and those who want to worship and follow him. He tells them, if anyone wants to come after me, if you want to be like me, if you want to worship me, then you must deny yourself. I mean, this is what Twyla was talking about, is showing up in the book of, what's it called again? How to Worship a King. We have to empty ourselves in worship. If you want to worship me, if you want to follow me, you must take up your cross and follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. That is surrender in worship. Life is worship, surrendering everything back to God. In Mark 10:28, Peter gets this because he looks at Jesus and he says, "We have left everything to follow you. We have surrendered everything to worship you." Then we go here. It says that we are doing that to focus on God and his character. When Jesus taught what it looked like to be his followers, and people asked him what the greatest commandment was, he said, you need to love God with all that you are, and to be focused on surrendering to God and loving him with all of your heart. We are to be focused and surrendered to God. He would then say the second commandment, right, is the same as the first, to love your neighbor as yourselves. Jesus' audiences would have known that when Jesus said the greatest command is to love God with all of your heart, it came out of Deuteronomy 6:4-9. Listen to this. Hear, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all your soul and all your strength. These commandments that I give you today be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk down the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and your gates. That's what worship looks like when we are focusing on surrendering to God and God's character. Now, we like talking about our personality test all the time. Hey, what are you on the Myers-Briggs? What are you on the Enneagram? What about StrengthsFinder? And we do this because we enjoy learning about our personalities. We learn to think about how we naturally are and to think, and that's not a bad thing. I enjoy that thing probably as much as anyone that I've ever met. But at the end of the day, we aren't called to know ourselves more and more as much as we are to know God more and more. To love God with all that you are removes us from ourselves and focuses on him and his character. And it's in worship that we find him. And we see that it transforms our individual lives and relationships. In Romans 12:2, again, we see that we need to focus on this continual renewal that leads to transformation. That's the word Paul uses there. Worship for David in Psalm 139 is the same. Worship is a practice of surrendering to God and his character in such a way that we say in worship, search me, O God, and know my heart, try my thoughts. So often when we worship, it's not this sense of looking for transformation. It's something we ought to do, or it's kind of this flirting thing we do right before we get to the message, which is, the most important thing in our mindsets. But worship is to be this place where we echo David and say, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try my thoughts. And then listen to what David says. In the middle of worship, he says, and see if there's any sin in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. That's what a value of worship looks like when we gather as people. We are each individually in a communal setting saying, search me, Lord. Is there sin in me? Help me get rid of it. As we focus on or contemplate, we are being transformed into his image. It also affects our relationships. Worship does not only transform who we are, but also as we are as individuals. It transforms what we announce, what we demonstrate, what we embody as the church. If we had some fighting kids and we locked them in a room and told them they wouldn't get out of that room until they learn to get along and do a project together, there's some amazingly fast miracle would happen. That those kids would begin to get along because they have something external from them to focus on. And maybe that's sometimes what the church needs. And for us, that value is worship. It doesn't matter that we don't always get along, but we'll learn to honor each other as we seek that higher thing together. When you go through something focused on something removed from yourself, it brings people together. The Azusa Street Revival in the 60s was a prayer meeting of Pentecostal African Americans in Southern California. Within a year, thousands upon thousands of both white and African American and even people from other continents were there worshiping together because what they were focused on was simple, the worship of God, seeking God and His presence. And what happened and what came out of that was the Methodist Church that had been segregated was no longer segregated because they focused on what? Worship. Now, if we go seeking out of justice, racism, and how to solve it, we actually remove God from the equation. But when we seek worship, when we put God in His rightful place, when we seek first the kingdom, the rest comes together. That is the value of worship. In 1 John, John's writing to his church plants and his disciples, and he says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus laid down His life for us. And then he tells them this. That's how you worship as well. And then he says, and now we ought to lay down our lives for each other. Worship transforms us to be caring and compassionate. So much so that John says, if anyone in the middle of a worship gathering has possessions and sees a brother or a sister in need and doesn't have pity, that person hasn't been transformed. Worship also transforms the way that we look and relate to each other. Wimber used to say, worship is an expression of awe, submission, and respect to God. I love that. Awe, you are so great. Submission, you are so great and I'm not. And respect. Lord, you are everything in my life. Carol Wimber used to say, worship involves not only our thoughts and our intellect, but also our body. As we study the Bible, as we see throughout the Bible, there are such forms in prayer and praise as singing, playing musical instruments, dancing, kneeling, bowing down, lifting hands, and so on. Worship is not only to be in everything that we do, it takes over everything that we are. William Temple, an early Pentecostal preacher, said, to worship is to quicken the conscience. I love that language. To quicken the conscience by the holiness of God. God, you are so great. You take over all of me. To feed the mind with the truth of God. To purge the imagination by the beauty of God. To open the heart to the love of God. And to devote the will to the purpose of God. Wow. J.I. Packer says, worship in the Bible involves praising Him for what He is, thanking Him for what He's done, and desiring Him to give Himself more glory. In worship, we're saying, God, be more you. Give more glory by further acts of His mercy, judgment, and power, and trusting in Him for our concerns, for our own well-being and others. And guess what, folks? When I say we value worship, this is the kind of worship I want to be part of. I want my conscience quickened. I want holiness. I want to be focused on Jesus. I'm not interested in any other kind of worship. And if we would ever move from that kind of worship into anything else, I'm going to be gone. This is what worship is. This is the biblical mandate of worship. That wasn't supposed to be like threatening. I'm just saying I want to invest my life in this kind of worship. Psalms 100, the psalm that we looked at when we came in today, that played the video in between the worship time and the rest of worship time, showed Psalm 100. Everything we do on a Sunday should be this kind of worship. Shout for joy to the Lord. All the earth, worship the Lord with gladness. Come before Him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. There's nothing in there that talks about what we get from God. Worship is knowing that the Lord is God. It is He who made us, and we are His people, the sheep of His pasture. So we are to enter His gates with thanksgiving, His courts with praise. Let me just pause here real quick. If I'm having a barbecue at my house, Usually, what do when you show up at my house? You bring something to share, right? You bring a hospitality gift. Folks, when we show up on Sunday morning, we're going to God's barbecue. Like, we are to show up already with thanksgiving and courts of praise. It's not something we do here just to get to the message. We show up with those things already. Don't worry, God, I'm ready for this. I already brought everything. We give thanks to him and we praise his name, for the Lord is good and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. I love this idea of worship. Rabbi Cook says, I like to say Rabbi Cook, but I think it's Cook. The first step towards serving God in joy is recognizing his infinite grandeur. We're moved by who God is. Beyond all boundaries and no limits, no nature can restrict the vastness of divine kindness from spreading in the world. We bless God because of his grandeur. We focus on him and his character. And in that, we realize that as we bless God, he will bless us with his presence because he relates to us. The rabbi says, along with this recognition, we must be aware of God's profound connection to us. In worship, God connects with us. Despite his incomparable loftiness, God relates to his creations with boundless care and concern. We worship to bless God, and in return, God will bless us with his presence. So why do we worship? And why do we worship through song? We worship through song because it connects with us like nothing else does. We worship through song because God tells us to. We worship through song because it's something removed from all of us that keeps us together. And it keeps us reminding of us of our reason. God's kindness, his love. It's exalting. It puts God where he's supposed to be. It's adoration. It recognizes God is who he says he is. It's thanksgiving. We are worshiping and remembering what God did for us. It's confession. We are saying, search me. This is what worship is. It's come and get me, Lord. It's surrender. Lord, you can have it. It's remembrance. Lord, I remember not only what you've done for me, but the generations before me. It is a remembrance of how faithful God has been. And worship is both communal and individual. It is something we do at home so that we can do together. So we close. I have a short video clip, and after this video clip, the worship team will close us out. And as we close out, uphold our core value of worship. Allow it to transform who you are.
Over the years, having been a pastor quite a few years, I've heard numerous times, I didn't get anything out of worship. And I gently explain to them, you're not supposed to get anything out of worship. You're supposed to give something out of worship. It's not for you, it's him. Years and years ago, I was at one of my children's friend's birthday party. She was only 6, if I remember right. And we went, and her older sister, who was 8, was angry. Because everything, all the birthday stuff said the other girl's name, and all the birthday stuff was for her. It had pictures of her all over the house and all over the patio area. And there was a big prize and gift for her, and there was a cake for her. And the mother had, at one point, the older sister was stamping her foot and just with indignant rage, And her mother had to pull her aside, and I still remember her gently but firmly saying, it's not about you. It's about your sister. It's your sister's birthday, not your birthday. I've never forgotten that. Now, I don't mean to do that to you, but I want you to know it's not about you. It's about him. It's about you growing closer to him. It's about you being prepared by the blood of Jesus, through the forgiveness of God, by the drawing of God, to worship him. So worship isn't for you, it's for him. Turn to the person next to you and say, it's for him. Now, if you got that, you got the price of admission right there. Because that's what it's all about. Now, I love it. I like what happens. I like the dynamic of it, the vibes and all. I love it. And It's a major, major part of my life. But the center of it is, does it please you, Lord? Does it please you? Does our collecting together and worshiping, congregating together and worshiping please you? Is it blessing you, Lord? Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. A good worship service then has both the dynamic of being graded and received in heaven, as well as what happens here. We might walk away and say, well, that was a good one, but the Lord's going, you're drawing near to me with your mouth, but your hearts are far from me. That was what happened in the Gospels, remember? So it's very important for us to understand that worship, beginning and end, is for God, and that this is preparation for that is to come. A few years back, I can't remember what it was, but I walked into one of my grandsons. I have 11 of them, grandchildren. And this one was about 9 at the time, and it was early afternoon, and he had the television on, and he was watching one of these like highway patrol movies or screening. I don't even know. I don't watch them, so I don't know exactly what they are, but evidently they are either enacting or taking actual footage of arresting somebody. And one of the policemen were standing outside, and they had a gun in there. This guy gets out of the car, and he goes like that. And Courtney turns out and looks, is he worshiping? Get it? Get it? You see, that's what this is. I give. You're right, I'm wrong. You're holy, I'm not. I yield myself to you. I give myself to you. You're the only good I've ever known. The only resource on earth for life. You, oh God, are all of it. It's all about you. All right, we're going somewhere, and we're going to do something. We're going to worship God forever. No coffee breaks. All right? That's what I'm telling you. And when we do, we all are doing no excuses, no late passes, no notes from your mother. Oh, I don't feel like worshiping today. So, you're there to worship. And so I would recommend that knowing that, you would take full knowledge of that now and begin your preparations. I can't tell you, there's so many scriptures I could go through, Hebrews alone, things that talk about the preparations of the Lord in a person's life for worship. But quite often people walk in here and say they're not ready to worship. Well, they probably, husband and wife just had an argument. They couldn't find the shoes. You don't know that one, do you? Couldn't find the shoes. Couldn't find the checkbook. And blah, 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 blah to each other. And now all of a sudden they're here. And they got to put on the attitude. We didn't really argue way all over here, and the kids are going, walk along behind. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. I heard them. Yeah, they did. And that is hardly the preparations of the Lord. But as I understand the admonition of Scripture, we're to come before the Lord with an awareness of the fact that He is Lord and that He's worthy of our praise and our worship, our adoration. And it doesn't end with a few songs or a prayer. It never ends, but in one sense, in our context, we usually worship the Lord, and then we give and worship the Lord in the giving, and then we study the Word together, we worship the Lord in that, and then we minister to one another, and we worship the Lord in that, and then we stop that and go feed the hungry. And that's Sunday till about 2:30 or 3. And then we go home, take a break, and then come back and do it again. Are you hearing me? You see, worship, as I'll talk later on this week, is all of it. It's everything you do. It's how you drive your car, how you pay your taxes, how you spank your children, to correct them. It's the attitude with which you approach everything. 5 things. Worship in heaven is everybody does it. 2, you do it with your voice and your being, your body, your mind, your heart, everything that's in you, focused on God. 3, it's worship to God, or it's about God and for God. And then last of all, it goes on forever and ever and ever. We do it and 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 never get tired of it. So, take a clue. Get with it now.